My name is Berger Williams. I'm a fellow here at Civic Series. We're a nonprofit organization that helps you understand, think for yourself, and have meaningful conversations about the most important issues of our time. Our events, like this one, helps you get oriented to what's going on with these topics, like the metaverse, and allow you to ask questions of experts in nonpartisan and safe space. Today, we'll be asking our guest expert, what is the metaverse? What does it look like in the future? And how does human interaction change through the development of the metaverse, maybe 10, 30, 50 years from now? How does it look? But before we begin, I'd like to give a big thank you to our largest donors, the Lincoln and Therese Filene Foundation, the Ryman Reason Fund of the Boston Foundation, and the Harris family, as well as all of you who donated when you registered. Big thank you so much. And I want to also extend a big thank you to my team, Thea, Danny, Laura, D'Angelo, for helping me put this together. You're all rock stars. Being a part of Civic Series has been, for me, truly rejuvenating. Currently, I study at Suffolk University in politics, philosophy, and economics. I'm minoring in big data. And bridging communities and getting to the crux of the conversation is super special and I think very rare. I think being able to give people power to their voice is huge. So I'm very passionate about being here. Civic Series is a 501c3 charity, and if you could spare a donation, your contributions go very far in letting us produce content like this. You can find us on PayPal or Venmo, or visit civicseries.org/donate. We've included these links in the chat. And if you've already donated or choose to donate now, thank you so much for your contribution again. So let's get to it. Here's how tonight's going to go. For the first 20 minutes or so, John and I will have a fireside chat and give an overview of what the metaverse is. And then we'll open it up for your questions for about 40 minutes or so. At the top of the hour, we'll jump into breakout groups, and then we'll come back for 20 minutes to answer some more questions and wrap up around 8:30 or so. Our events are pretty interactive. I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Thea, who's going to explain how this will work for those of you who are new to Civic Series.
Hi, everybody. My name is Thea. We invite you to turn on your video if you can, though you will still be muted. If you have any questions and you're in the Zoom, send it to me in the Zoom chat box. And then when we get to the Q&A section of this event, we'll introduce you, and then you'll be able to come on mute, and then you'll be able to also ask your question live. And do please have your video camera on if you can. And if you're watching from YouTube and you prefer to text or call, you can just text your question to 617-398-0051. I'll also put it in the chat for everyone. There you go. And then, as Berger said, at 8 o'clock, we'll go into breakout rooms for about 7 to 8 minutes. And this is a time to help you digest what we just discussed and talk with people here about what's on your mind. If during the breakout session, the conversation comes to a natural close, you don't want to stay in the breakout room, feel free to leave your group and come back to the main Zoom area. And I think that's all. Back to you, Richard.
All right. Thank you, Thea. Again, I want to emphasize that there's no such thing as a dumb question. Okay, the point of Civic Series is to ask questions that you fear are too dumb to ask anywhere else. And the metaverse it can be complex. There's a lot of questions to it. So feel free to ask them. We'd love to hear from you. Well, let's get to our next step. I am very pleased to introduce our guest expert today, Jon Radoff, CEO and co-founder of Beamable, a live game service platform that enables the creation of online games. He has spent time at Harvard University studying cognitive neuroscience and becoming a teaching fellow, and is well-versed on what the metaverse is. And we are very, very excited to have you here today and hear from you today. How are you?
I'm great, thank you.
Good, good. Is there anything you wanted to add before we jump into it about anything you're working on or anything?
Let's dive right in.
Let's dive right in.
You want to hear about me? You want to hear about the metaverse?
All right.
Look me up later if they want.
I hear you. Okay, so first question that I have that a lot of us are wondering, what is the metaverse? And can you help us understand it like we've never heard the term before?
Well, the metaverse is just the next generation of the internet. It's the most basic way to think about it. A lot of what people think of with the metaverse is the things you're going to do in the metaverse, what you're going to do in the next generation of the internet. And a lot of that is very informed by game technology.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the things that people show you, like these 3D graphic immersive worlds, they're all built on game technology and game experiences. But a lot of these things are what I describe as game adjacent rather than games themselves. So they'll tend to be music and social experiences and education and travel. Those are some examples of it. But, I find that people want to define metaverse by like technological descriptions or product descriptions, like, oh, it's going to have this and this and this features, and then it'll be the metaverse. That's how Facebook, now that they're called Meta, tends to talk about it. I don't actually think that's what's important about it. I think it's more important to understand what it means from a culture and social standpoint. And I'm one who believes the metaverse already exists in terms of how we use it, because what the metaverse is, separating the technology, is it's a shared space for imagination, creativity, social connection with other people. And that's been going on, for decades now on the internet. I think in some ways it predated the internet. It was Dungeons and Dragons. If anyone's ever heard of that, Dungeons and Dragons is a place of creativity, storytelling. We share an imagination in a virtual world. It just wasn't digital. Now we're adding all of the digital scaffolding around that. And that's kind of what the metaverse is.
Okay. I love that. So the metaverse is like this social space. People can be themselves. You said it's the next generation of the internet, right? So the metaverse is like a combination or like an evolution of social media and virtual reality, would you say?
Well, let's clarify one thing. You said where they can be themselves. Yeah, sure. That's a way that you can present yourself in the metaverse. But what has been happening for the last 20 years or so is that people have started to have a digital identity or a form of digital expression that in many ways is more important than even their physical expression, right? So there's billions of people on the internet today. In that you've got like 3 billion gamers in the world. So if you think about all the things people are doing online, whether it's playing an online game or being in a social network or, whatever you're doing online, that digital expression is now more important than the way you might express yourself outside in the world. And you said, be yourself, right? Like, not necessarily. Like, actually the metaverse is very emancipatory in that you can express yourself how you want to exist in that virtual space. So it allows one to sort of make your identity in digital space, and you might have more than one identity. You might express yourself in different ways in different settings, right? So I think it's a very creative space where we have our identity and we take it with us from experience to experience, but actually it's how we see ourselves and how we want to express ourselves in all these different settings.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. You can create these different types of beings that you want to be or don't want to be. It's creative, and I love that portion about the metaverse. It stimulates and breeds creativity. It's really beautiful in that way. And you mentioned that people can create these different versions of themselves or of iterations of themselves in different settings. Do you mind going into a little bit more detail about the different types of settings people can create these iterations of themselves, or what they want to be and what that looks like?
Well, the term that you're using is an avatar. So an avatar is how we present ourselves within these virtual spaces. So an avatar can be everything from you're on Twitter and you get that little profile pic. That's a way of expressing yourself. Right. It could be a 3D game, like a World of Warcraft, where you go in and it's your character that you're playing there. Yeah. It could be the more social applications, like Facebook has this environment called Horizons. There's also these things like Rec Room that are present there. One that a lot of people have heard of is Roblox. So Roblox is about 250 million people a month, just to put it in perspective, who are going going into Roblox and they're making things and they're making worlds, they're making games. Not everything there is a game. Sometimes it's just purely experiential, and lots of people enter this world with a different kind of avatar expression there. So different worlds, different settings all have different means of manifesting it. And, that's just sort of one dimension of it too, because that's what you look like maybe, but then what you say, what you do, what you create in those environments is part of that as well. So when I go onto Twitter, for example, and I share content or I share articles that I've written, that is presenting myself in a particular way in that setting that's, about who I want to be in that space, which is, someone who happens to know about metaverse and games and things like that. But if I'm playing a game, I'm not talking about metaverse. I'm probably just playing the game, playing a character.
Right. Exactly. I hear that. That's a good synopsis of that. The avatar is huge because, like you said, we use that on our different social medias that we have today or in games. It's sort of ourselves in these ways that we want to be, just digitally.
But I think an important part there that I don't want to be missed is the ability to experiment and express yourself through different identities online as well. So like actually when I met my future wife in an online game, I was playing a female character at the time. And
that's amazing.
Which is not something that carries into my into my physical identity. I identify as male, but when I played this game, I was a female character and I was certainly identifying as female there. And I actually befriended her as a female character. Took her a couple of days to figure out that I wasn't IRL, but that's sort of like, I think some of the experimentation that people are doing. So I think there's a huge opportunity to create more empathy and understanding and see the world through different perspectives that are different from your own. Like when you go onto your Facebook identity is very much tied to your real identity. And of course, in social media, it's a idealized version of that identity. Like we post our coolest pictures and we talk about the topics that are sort of something we want to associate with our identity and all that stuff. So it's not exact, even that is not quite our real identity, but it's a version of our real identity that we bring into that. But it isn't as experimental, say, as I go into a virtual world space or an online game or engage with music or something like that, where I might want to try something completely different.
Gotcha. Okay. So we covered a lot there, and within that, I had a few questions I wanted to jump in with, because this is all very, very interesting to me. Using social media, it's almost like we kind of, like you said before, we are already in this metaverse that that we're already interacting with it, and it's something that's prevalent that we use all the time, whether it's social media, our phones, our watches. We have the goggles now with AR and VR. How does all these things in the metaverse play a part in how it can be used for people's businesses? I know you mentioned Zoom meetings before. They can be in virtual spaces to facilitate Zoom meetings, but what does that look like within business areas?
Well, we're doing it now, right? So this is the metaverse at this very moment. It's included in my definition. Now in the next couple of generations of this, it may be a more embodied experience where we're wearing AR and we feel more like we're physically present, because although this is really a huge step up, say, versus a telephone hotline, we could be having this conversation just in pure audio. And in fact, there are some very popular platforms in social audio, Twitter Spaces, and another one called Clubhouse, where it is audio. In some ways, the audio experience actually feels more real than a Zoom meeting, and just in my own subjective experience, because there's kind of a bit of an uncanny valley here in terms of like, I'm looking at this gallery of different videos and everybody's looking back at me. It's not like a real space that we would occupy. And that means that there's a lot of, it's very good, but it's a lower bandwidth form of communication than if we were physically present in a space together, where we would fully capture our body language, because body language, for example, is a lot more even than me using my hands and stuff. Like, body language is included in even how we position ourselves relative to each other in a space. Like, there's so much more that goes into organic communication than what we're capturing right now in Zoom. So there's a hope that over the next few years, and there's quite a few major technological barriers to it, but as we get, say, AR and VR, the form factor a lot simpler and cooler looking, and longer battery life and higher processing speeds, that then we'll actually be able to go into a virtual space with digital holograms, so we actually feel like we're in the same room with each other, and we would gain the benefit of all that communication. Now, you asked about business applications of it. That's the meeting. I would say there's a lot of applications around that. Obviously, like, the entertainment aspects that are kind of adjacent are one thing, like music and immersive theater and all these other applications that will grow out of games and expand into this. But think about all the education and training examples, for example. So there's training and education business, there's education and training, be it vocational or academic, outside of that as well. And I think there's a huge opportunity to bring people together in these spaces, connect them together, so the best instructors, the best teachers, the best people who want to learn are actually connected digitally to each other. You don't have to be in a physical space. You can actually make it much more abundant to a large number of people. And then those instructors can enhance the experience with digital holograms that add content that's interactable, so that they really enrich the learning experience. So that would be one example of what you can do when you bring together people in a virtual space.
Gotcha. That makes, I'm following you here. There are a few points that you brought up that are really integral to what the metaverse is made up of. And I just want to do a few clarifying points, just so, because for some of it, I'm kind of curious about myself that I'm not sure. When we were talking AR and VR, and we get into these educational spaces where we can create spaces of like optimal success for people, and experiences for each other. Can we define exactly what AR and VR is at its core?
So virtual reality is an experience where you basically enter into a virtual space and it replaces your visual field. So instead of looking at a screen, the screen is basically right in front of your face, and it's able to fill peripheral vision, and you can move your head around. And what that does is it makes you feel like you're actually present within it. AR is basically the same thing, except that you see through the view field out into the real world, which means that you're looking around the room that you're actually in, but you're adding 3D imagery that changes the environment or adds to the environment around you. So that could include things such as labeling information, adding symbolic information to the world around you. You look at your refrigerator, and your refrigerator says what the internal temperature is, and it has an alert if there's a problem. Or a digital hologram, like in our education example, you are in a classroom learning about astronomy, and a map of the solar system is there, and you can actually manipulate it and see what all the heavenly bodies look like in our solar system on an interactive basis, where all the students are there together. So that's AR and VR.
That makes sense. Okay. I'm following you here. So my next question actually leads somewhat into what, what AR and VR is. So I kind of want to get into what the metaverse looks like, 10 years versus maybe 50 years from now. Because we see people, wear the VR and augmented reality goggles. We see the glasses that Google comes out with to create those instances and spaces where things are symbolized and you can see things happening right in front of you. And I've tried it myself. It's a cool experience. But in what ways do we see that taking effect in the like 10 years from now, 50 years from now, you think?
The biggest problem that any of these technologies have right now is that in general, the ergonomics are pretty poor. And when I say ergonomics, I don't just mean like how it feels on your head. I mean all aspects of the experience, from the user interfaces to how you can make use of it, even things like battery life. Like AR isn't that useful if it's just something that works 30 minutes at a time. You have to actually be able to integrate these technologies into your life on a continuous basis, in the same way that we now can make use of mobile phones, for example. So what I believe needs to happen on like this 10-year time horizon for it to become pervasive is overcome all of those ergonomic bottlenecks. So it has to be, it has to last a long time in terms of battery life. It has to look cool, by the way. Like, I don't know if anyone out there has watched that old movie Wall Street with Gordon Gekko. He kind of has like this brick phone next to his head in one of the scenes. Like we're at the brick phone level of these technologies right now. They're pretty clunky. They don't last. They're limited to a fairly small number of people that can even make use of it. And then if you want to create things in these environments, right? I think one of the big opportunities here is really democratize the creative process of these worlds as well. Because right now, that's really the domain of very well capitalized, big, game companies or Facebook themselves, things like that. Whereas I think you can kind of see a glimmer of it in these platforms like Roblox. So Roblox, like kids can start creating content, but even there, it's not quite easy enough. We got to get it to the point where it's direct from imagination to the screen or to the virtual world. And that's where really things are going to be going over the next 10 years, is getting the technology to be something people will want to use on a daily basis without it feeling either intrusive, weird looking, dorky, and also making sure that everybody can actually be a creator in this environment. Because the thing about the World Wide Web that made it so compelling in the first place was, it sort of like was the next level beyond the Gutenberg press, where we had the ability to just replicate information and put it out there, but still you had to own a press, and it was expensive, and you'd have to distribute, and it would still be limited by what we can do physically. So the World Wide Web digitized that whole experience. It made it so that anybody can become a publisher, and there's really no limits on distribution or replication. So we are not anywhere near that in terms of creating content and worlds and experiences in the metaverse yet, because just like the web needed, a few years between the time the web was created, where it became a creator platform of its own, the metaverse is going to need a whole tool chain to support that. And by the way, it's much, much more complex, because we're dealing with real-time, immersive experiences where people are connecting with each other socially in a space, whether it's audio, 3D graphics, 2D, or whatever. It's all very complex due to the real-time nature of it.
I got it. Okay. So the space that we're trying to give people the experience for in the metaverse that we are currently experiencing right now on Zoom, it's hard to say. Like, it's hard to say what's going to happen in 50 years. There's a lot of technological, barriers and obstacles to get around, to be able to really feel the full effects of what the metaverse could, optimally, ideally be. But I wanted to get into my next question, which was, when we are interacting with each other in this augmented reality and in the metaverse, and we do have these glasses on, these goggles on, is it going to be like we're all going to have like glasses that we have to be able to see the metaverse all the time, or is it going to be something more used if you want to use it, or do you think it's just going to we're naturally going to be in it all the time, like we are in Zoom now?
Well, I mean, we can travel out into the physical world, and like I hike and climb in the mountains, and I don't particularly need any digital technology to do that. So still going to be doing those kind of things. Yeah. I think that first of all, I just want to make it really super clear, like AR and VR are interesting interfaces to the metaverse, but that's not what the metaverse is actually about. It's this creative space, real-time interaction, which can exist in a lot of different formats. It could be video, it could be 3D worlds, it could be a website, it could be two-dimensional, it could be audio only, like Twitter Spaces kind of talk. So like those are all completely valid ways to participate in the metaverse. It doesn't have to be AR and VR.
Yeah. I hear you. I hear you. Before we get to our Q&As, I did have one last question I was curious about. Now, I don't know if you've heard this statement before. I remember, I think it was Elon Musk that said that we are somewhat like cyborgs because we have our watches, we have our computers, we have our phones, we're integrating ourselves with technology all the time. Do you think that it's going to continue to look like evolve in that same sort of manner, that we will integrate ourselves even more and more and more with AI and AR and VR and with the metaverse over time?
Yeah, I mean, that's what's unique about humans, is that we make use of technology. So this has been going on for a few million years, basically started with flint knapping tools. And ever since then, we've been just adding to that. Now, the interesting thing is how quickly that rate of progress is accelerated, because I think, as I understood it, like the first kind of stone tools that we use, like they existed for a million years, didn't really have any significant changes during that whole time. And then suddenly, like, people figured out a slightly better stone tool, and it was like for hundreds of thousands of years. So, like, really interesting. Now,
Yeah.
like the rate at which these technologies are accelerating is super interesting. And I think there's a bunch of convergent forces along with this. You're kind of talking about the tool use. I think of cybernetics, generally speaking, is just this trajectory of more and more tools that are closer and closer to us, closer and closer to the whole sensory motor
Mm-hmm.
processes of the human, whether that's, VR, giving you an input field, whether it's haptics, which is a technology for feeling things on your skin, whether it's the mouse that you use on your computer, right? Like a mouse or a touch screen is really just more cybernetic technology. All the whole point of that stuff is really just to cut down on the friction between you, the human, and that device. So where we're going to go with this next is also reduce the separation between humans in these virtual spaces, use the technology to transcend space and time in these virtual spaces. And then ultimately, you asked earlier, like 50-year time horizon, like ultimately we're also making virtual beings and applying to artificial intelligence, where that's going to really augment people. Like, there's people who get worried about artificial intelligence. They think it's going to be killer robots or a singularity where we don't do anything anymore. I'm actually of the mind that I think it's more of a collaboration, like humans and artificial intelligence will augment each other and will be enhancing each other through that, and creativity will explode. Like, if you want to create a virtual world, the way we go from imagination to the screen is you start telling the computer what you have in mind, and it becomes a creative partner for you in crafting and sculpting that virtual space.
Ah, I see. Okay. We covered a lot there. I have some thoughts on it, but I do want to get to the questions that we have from the people in the chat, from all you lovely folks. So thank you, John. I love conversing about this. This has been awesome. I'm excited to keep it going. So let's get into the Q&A part. Our first question is from Molly. Molly, I'm gonna stay. She wants me to ask the question for her. I'm gonna do that for you here. So we got. Okay, we should talk about some of the downsides onto the metaverse. So she was reading an article about a woman who was sexually assaulted in the metaverse. Does the metaverse present a place where people can do things that they can't do in real life without consequences? Will there be oversight, accountability, or punishment in the metaverse? And if so, who enforces this? What type of regulations we're looking at?
Well, I mean, so you're talking about a huge topic, and we could probably spend the entire time and then some talking about just this one piece of it. So I think a way to think of the metaverse, though, is the metaverse is not one thing, right? It's not, it's closer, it's more useful to talk about it as the internet or the World Wide Web. So of course, within that technology landscape, you're going to have places of the unregulated wild west where people are going to just do whatever the heck they want, because that's the nature of the internet and the web. And people that don't like that probably are not going to go to those places. You're going to have stuff at the opposite extreme, like a Roblox type thing, or even stuff more catered towards younger kids, which is going to be highly regulated. You're going to have controls over what you can communicate, what you can look like, what you can do. Then there's going to be everything in between. So for example, a lot of these 3D social environments, they've noticed the exact thing that you refer to there, Molly. And of course, that's horrifying. That's why some of these environments have started to do things like people can't actually get into your personal space in the 3D system. You actually have things like you have a bubble. You have effectively a digital bubble around you where people can't come in without permission. So you're able to make control. You have controls that determine what people are able to do. You can do things like, just as you can like filter text in certain applications, you can filter animations, but that'll be done on a platform by platform basis. So just keep in mind that like we're talking about the entire internet. We're not talking about like one thing where Facebook is going to set up a whole regime of controls and monitoring systems and permissions and whatnot, because it's going to vary all over the place, and it'll vary by culture, and it'll vary by like different parts of the world with their own versions of free speech. And then we're going to find in some countries that there's probably versions of it that we would find here in the, I think most of us are in the US and Canada here. Like you'll probably find that there's metaverses out there where you'd find it oppressive how much that they're going to take. Like if there's a Chinese version of the metaverse, it's probably going to be highly restrictive. Like the Chinese government has already banned certain games that you'd think of as pretty harmless, like Animal Crossing, because in Animal Crossing, people were talking about Hong Kong independence. So they're like, nope, can't have that, shut off Animal Crossing. So it's very, very complex. But I think in general, like anytime there's a new technology that enables social, interaction before people, there's always a lag between the introduction of these technologies and how we can make it, inclusive and safe for the people who want to participate there. Happened with the telephone too, right?
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you for that, John. We're going to go to our next question. We have that from Mr. Bill Fisher. Would you like to unmute yourself, Bill, and ask your question to John?
Sure. Hi, and Breege, thank you so much for this conversation. This is kind of maybe a mind-bending question for you, John, but you seem to have gray hair that you should be able to handle this. So I wonder, do you see the metaverse in a brave new world kind of view? Like what could the metaverse be doing now to help Ukrainians in their fight to keep their country, and or to potentially cripple the Russians by either shutting down the electric utility systems, phone networks, communications, sabotaging communications? Do you see that happening potentially now, or do you see that happening in the future for future incursions?
So I don't know that the metaverse really applies directly to what's going on in Ukraine right now. Like other than broadly speaking, the internet is a field of war in Ukraine. I posted an article about this just a few days ago on my blog, so I'll post it in the chat when we get a moment. But this is the first time we've had like essentially a real-time war going on the internet. Of course, we've had other conflicts, many of which, we here in the US initiated ourselves or participated in, but not in a modern society where the people who were subject to the violence had such pervasive access to technology. So you're seeing things happen here, which I don't think are necessarily, like, I'm probably just not able to come up with enough of an imaginative explanation of like 3D virtual worlds and how it intersects with this, but I can tell you what people are doing right now. Like the amount of crowdsourced intelligence going on, just as one example, is pretty fascinating because, many of you probably remember like the Boston Marathon bombing. Well, the reason why they were able to find the perpetrator so rapidly was because everybody had a cell phone and there were lots of videos and lots of pictures, and it just wasn't that hard to kind of piece together the information and rapidly figure out who was involved. So now apply that to a war zone. So what you've got is people recording videos of everything from human rights abuses that are happening there, to troop movements, to material that they've located or destroyed. And they're aggregating all this video and photo information. And what that then is allowing people to do is crowdsource intelligence around it, because there's all these people out there who are vehicle identification experts. Like I saw something today and he was able to explain to me, like, look at this vehicle, you can see why the Russians are breaking down, because like these tires have not been properly taken care of, and wow, they must be really incompetent to even send this to a war zone. So like you're getting this massive amount of crowdsourced intelligence, which then is going back to the Ukrainian fighters, who are using that information to do things like actually locate, places where they're going to fight back. So that's an example. Now, could you start to imagine a future where they start simulating some of that in 3D space, and you can visualize the world around you in a way that's a lot harder to do with static photos and images and videos? You can imagine kind of synthesizing it into a world simulation. Maybe that's an application of it. But clearly, if we just think more broadly about the internet, the interesting application of a lot of these things is not just the fact that the technology exists, but when it becomes pervasive. So there's going to be a lot of applications for AR, for example, when a huge number of people are walking around in a society with AR glasses, and they're using it to augment their environment, and they're using things like AI to curate and understand the environment. Maybe in the future, the AR metaverse version of a war zone is going to tell you, like, avoid this area. Like, we just have intel that there's some bad dudes around the corner.
Gotcha. And the AR is the actual, so I started to jump in here. The AR is the glasses. The AI is the artificial intelligence gathered from the glasses. Yes?
Yeah, AI is more than just the data collected in the glasses, but artificial intelligence is just using computers to help provide creativity or decision-making or information that would have otherwise required a lot of human work.
Okay, gotcha. Okay. All right, well, thank you, Bill, for your question. Thank you, John. Next, we have Albors. I hope I said that correctly. Would you like to ask your question? If you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you have a great voice too. So, you feel free to say my question for me. But it's just basically like we're at a really early stage of Metaverse and NFTs and everything to do with Web3. I think I'd heard of NFTs before I'd even heard of Web3, and I'd heard of blockchain before I'd heard of NFTs, and this is all really new. So I just wanted to kind of get from a very generalist perspective, because I don't want to pigeonhole anybody to, I know everyone's got their own interests and their own diversities and their own areas of interest. But just what are some ways that people can kind of get ahead of this, and what are some things that people could be focusing on right now to understand it more, to be able to be a leader in the space instead of a follower? Is it just as simple as like, everyone should just mint something right now? Or is it more like, are there more foundational tools that people can learn, maybe some coding languages? I don't know. I'm just kind of throwing things in the air. But from a very general point of view, I just want to know, what are some ways that people can basically prepare themselves for this when it does get beyond the clunky cell phone stage, so that they're not like, oh snap, I didn't think it was going to be this BlackBerry, but they're actually part of forming that BlackBerry and part of forming that iPhone.
Okay. Well, I guess we have to define a few things to answer your question, just so everyone can access your question. So there's a technology called blockchain, and blockchain is essentially a way to share a transaction history. It's like having an accounting book, but making a copy of that accounting book with everybody who wants to participate in a particular economy. And the advantage of it is you can have things like currencies and assets that are exchanged between the participants on that blockchain without having a central authority like a bank or a company that you need to trust to organize it all for you. And the benefit of it is potentially that there are, fewer rents and such within the whole network of transactions that are happening. Like a bank can kind of dictate and costs $20-$30 to do a wire transfer on Fedwire. They can do that because they can, really, because it's a monopoly for certain kinds of institutions. So anyway, again, like blockchain would be like a whole 1 hour conversation that we could have. I would say you asked like, what's the actionable thing? I don't really necessarily advocate like dive in, mint an NFT. That's not, so an NFT is like a digital asset. So you can create in it, there's cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin or Ethereum are currencies that exist on blockchain technology. A NFT stands for non-fungible token, which is just a way of saying it's an asset that exists in the blockchain. So it could be a piece of art, could be a potion in an online game, but you could even use an NFT to represent physical assets. Like another way to think of blockchain is it's like the title system or the deed system for real estate. It just keeps a history of all the transactions that happen. So you can have a house, a piece of real estate in the physical world. Well, an NFT is also a way to digitally represent that. You can allow people to trade that asset online to determine ownership. But the main challenge here is that it's just so new. And if you're curious about it, certainly you should learn about it. There's a combination of, utopian idealism on one extreme of this thing. And then there's like just real cynicism on the other extreme. I don't think that either of those extremes is like where you necessarily want to land. I would just start learning about it. Because the interesting thing about this technology is it allows applications and virtual worlds to be created that exchange assets with each other. That's sort of the really interesting thing about it. So you can have a piece of property that exists in one world or one application. You can trade it on another marketplace, which is not run by that same company, and then import it into a whole other world. Or if you're making a piece of art, some kind of digital online gallery, so there's all these different applications of it that is still very, very early in the process, but it's all about peer-to-peer exchanges of value, peer-to-peer exchanges of assets is the benefit of it, as opposed to having a custodian who you have to go through for everything, who takes a big chunk of the economic value out of the system. But also, because these things are able to plug in with each other, you're also enabling a whole universe of software development to happen as well. So if you look at the history of the internet, much of the internet we have now around the World Wide Web is because there was open source software where people could make some code that allowed information to be exchanged with each other. What blockchain does is it does for assets and currencies and value the same thing that open source software did for information. So that may lead to a lot of really interesting applications.
You said some very interesting things there, John. Especially I was going to ask some questions about just clarifying questions about NFTs. We brought up NFTs, cryptocurrency, blockchain, and these are all components that you can utilize within the metaverse. And you brought up an example of being able to purchase in the metaverse a plot of land or something like that nature, or have pictures as NFTs. So those would be the NFTs, that either the artwork or that plot of land that then you can purchase with cryptocurrency to then have a gallery of these types of things in these different digital worlds. Am I getting that right?
Those are applications of it. To be clear,
Okay.
like blockchain, you don't need blockchain to have a metaverse. You can have creative spaces where people interact with each other and go on adventures, enjoy music, have business meetings. All of these applications that we talked about earlier, those are entirely possible without blockchain and NFTs and virtual real estate that's for sale on a marketplace. What these technologies add to that equation is the ability to create virtual spaces where you also have a virtual economy around them, where people are trading with each other freely with things like art, potions and swords in an online game, pieces of land. The real benefit, in my view, isn't just the fact that you have this exchange taking place, because you can already go play lots of online games with things you can buy and sell inside the game. What this is doing is it's allowing people to build additional applications, new worlds, new pieces of software that add to it, so that it's the software that can consume these assets and let you do new and unique things. So what it does is it creates this iterative process where the content, the assets evolve over time and other contributors add to it. And you're building things. That's why I used the open source analogy before. Open source, you start with a piece of software code that you put out there, and then someone else wants to contribute. So they grab that piece of code, they add to it, they republish it, and it goes through this iterative growth process. So we're so early, it's kind of impossible other than to just dream about all the things we do with it. But what you're doing is you're bringing that kind of emergent behavior, that iterative behavior, to the world of assets, content, digital property. And it could be everything from like the costume that we wear as avatars to a piece of land in a virtual world. When you buy land in the metaverse, by the way, it's not really the metaverse. It's going to be a piece of land in a specific thing that someone has created.
That sounds like fun.
People are all discovering this now.
Yes. I mean, that sounds like a lot of fun, going to a friend's house in their metaverse, some art, right? That sounds like a great time.
There's a fun aspect to it. There's an expressive element to it. And there's also physical real world things. I mean, just as one example of how that works, I advise a company that their idea is to, so everyone collects, a lot of people collect trading cards, right? So they have an idea, which is, well, send in so the normal problem is like, it takes so much time and energy to trade cards with each other. You got to mail it off, all that stuff. You got to sell it and buy it. So what they want to do is take the trading card, you send it to them, they put it in a custodial facility where they store it for you very securely. They grade it, meaning they tell you what the quality level is, and then they mint an NFT from that. Now people who want to collect that trading card can just trade it in a very liquid manner online. So they have the NFT representing the original thing, and they can trade it with each other to their heart's content. And then someday when someone wants, if they ever want the physical card again, you can essentially trade it in, you get the physical card back, and it's, mailed out to you.
Right. That makes sense. Okay. I do want to touch on, we have a question coming from Claudia. It was something that we mentioned a little bit earlier. Claudia, did you want to unmute yourself and ask the question, or did you want us to ask it for you? Hello. All right, I got you. Okay, so Claudia's question, it came from a little bit earlier in our conversation. We just touched on it briefly. It was about, what is Web3? So what is Web3?
So Web3 is really just the idea of creating a set of APIs, more or less. An API is an application programming interface, which is something that software coders use, so that they can build applications that incorporate functionality that someone else has created into their application. And what it does is it lets you have web browser applications where you can exchange assets with that application or with other users of the application. And typically you connect to that website, that web application, through a digital wallet, which contains cryptocurrency. So that's kind of the heart of what Web3 is.
Okay, that's good. That's good. Again, if you guys have some more questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. There are some questions that were asked when we all registered to be a part of this event tonight. So while you guys put in some questions, I'll ask you, John, one of the questions that came from our Eventbrite. And that is, what is the metaverse and how does it serve Meta? for Facebook?
Well, that's a good question for Mark Zuckerberg. I was talking about this word before it entered his vocabulary, but I think he sees it as the next evolution of social networks. So he kind of sees the social network being the foundational era that kind of contains the relationships and the expressions that people have, and then bringing that expression into 3D shared spaces is really his definition of it. He's big on it being fused with VR, and that you're in there having this, what they call an embodied experience, meaning, which if you haven't tried VR, you can see why it's called an embodied experience. So you put it on, you kind of, within a few minutes, you do kind of feel like you're there. I mean, interestingly enough, just to continue with the embodied experience aspect of this, since that's so central to them, like Molly earlier was asking about some of the scary kind of downsides, because it's like, just sort of a wild, wild west in a lot of these platforms. And to tell you, when there's an interesting application called Rec Room, which provides one of these 3D spaces in VR where you can go in. It's unique in that you can do it in VR, but you can also do it in your web browser. And when I look in at the world on my screen and I just see people running around, it's kind of like a game. And you don't really worry that much about like people's personal space when you're just looking down on a screen, because it's just all these animated characters running around. But when you're embodied in that space and it wraps around you and it's mapping to your body movement and you're there, I found, this is again just totally subjective for me, I found that suddenly I started worrying about stuff like personal space. Like suddenly it became weird if I got too close to someone. I started having some of those same organic, evolved biological systems kick in a way that isn't really present when you look at a screen. So, I think that that's something that excites some people at Metaverse, at Meta, not Metaverse. And Meta is just going to be a Metaverse. It's not going to be the Metaverse. It'll be a version of this. They're excited by that embodied experience that they believe will bring in new forms of empathy, cooperation, relationships between people that I think in their view potentially solves some of the issues of, when we go onto these social networks today, it's very easy to dismiss other people as human beings because they're just sort of an avatar with a line of text, and you don't get all the context and you don't get all of the emotion that is carried with that. But if you could bring it into a virtual space, the idea is that people might respect each other more, which I've actually found to be the case in certain platforms like social audio. Is a really interesting place to experience that. But that said, I've heard from people that don't have that experience in those settings either. And, everybody has a different experience there. And that's why some people are building different systems for protection. But I don't know, Metaverse, I think they see it as their destiny, and they made a lot of investments in VR, and they're continuing to make a lot of hardware investments because they also see that as like a hardware platform.
Right. I hear that. Appreciate that answer. Meta is one meta and multi-metaverse. So it's around the time of 8. We're going to go into groups sessions here and talk to each other about some questions, takeaways that we have. We're going to go into some breakout rooms. I'm going to put inside of the chat some things that you guys can reflect on with each other. It'll be a few of us at a time. And we are going to come back to ask more questions. I see we have a few more in here that we're definitely going to make sure we get to. But let's, Danny, if you want to put us into breakout rooms for us for the next, it's going to be for the next like 8 minutes or so. And then we'll come back and we'll chat some more. Sound good? All right. Awesome.
Hey guys, you should see an option at the bottom right of your screen on the Zoom to join the breakout if you would like.
Hey there, Danny.
Hi. Do you see the option at the bottom of your screen to join?
I think it was just me and Toby.
It says Toby and D'Angelo are in there. And then,
Gotcha. I didn't. That's okay. Thank you for setting that up. All right.
So Danny and Thea, just so you know, I guess Thea's not in this room, but I'll let Danny and Berger know. I can't use the chat. If I answer your questions in the chat on my computer, Ecamm Live will pick that up. So I'm on my phone, so you'll see two instances of Lar Hesse Fisher. Chat with not this one, and I'll be able to see it.
SK is my sister, by the way. Hi, SK.
Hi, SK. Nice to have you join us.
This
You're
is
on mute, by
Lowell.
the way.
She might be muted there. That's okay.
Oh, I totally was muted. I'm so sorry. Hi. I didn't mean to interrupt your train of thought. I was just trying to join a breakout room. I had to fix my iPad settings.